Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm your host, Rebecca Rose. As always, you can find us on Twitter using hashtag the Space Policy Show, and you can engage with our experts on Vimeo in the chat box. We would love it if you would sign up for our latest news and alerts at aerospace.org/policy. Today's episode is on constructive visioning for the space enterprise. Kara Cunzeman and Jim Dator will discuss his 4 archetypes in futures thinking and how they apply to the future of space. Jim is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He was Editor-in-Chief of the World Futures Review and a former President of the World Future Studies Federation. Kara is Lead Futurist for Aerospace's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. She focuses on formal methodologies in futures thinking and helping aerospace prepare and shape the future through innovative approaches across strategy, acquisition, S&T, policy, and operations. Welcome, Kara, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Well, I am super stoked for today's show. As Rebecca mentioned, we have Jim Dator here with us. Hi, Jim. How are you?
Doing fine. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much for coming. I am just so excited. You know, you're such a thought leader for the foresighting community. And we're just thrilled to kind of take our time today and walk through kind of our thoughts on and perspectives on the 4 futures. But I wanted to kind of dive a little bit deeper into your background first. I will read a little bit more of a bio here. And then I am also going to kind of walk through one of our recent publications that we're going to weave into our discussion today. So a little bit of 4 futures and then a little bit of Aerospace Pathfinder's Guide to the Future here. So a little bit of background for the audience. If you don't know Jim, he's one of the world's most premier leaders in modern foresighting efforts, and we're just so excited to have him. He's a professor emeritus at Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, Department of Political Science, University of Hawaii at Manoa. And since 1994, he was a professor at the International Space University in Strasbourg, France, teaching an array of courses and workshops in space humanities, especially futures of space, art, and space, including space fiction, and focusing on ethical questions for space, and particularly designing new forms of governance for space settlements. So the one and only Jim Dator is here with us, and I'd like to initially just kind of get your take on your career and perspectives along the years you've been working futures on space, kind of over the decades. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, you are in trouble asking an old man to talk about his history, but I'm going to do it since you asked. And, you know, in many ways, there was once a time when the future meant space, and space meant the future. And that was in the 50s and 60s, especially, that the two of them were joined. Now, I happened to have my very first teaching position as a university professor at a Japanese university, Rikyo Daigaku in Tokyo. I had been sent to Yale to learn Japanese, so I more or less was lecturing in Japanese about American government. That's what I was hired to teach, about what American political science and American government was actually about. But while I was there, I was really interested in seeing why that country had transformed from a feudal society during what's called the Tokugawa period within 10 years into a modern society, and by the 60s and beyond, one of the major leading countries in the world. So I was interested in understanding how that process worked, and therefore the relationship between social values and technology. is what it turned out to be. A specific set of technologies that oriented Japanese towards the future in a very positive way. But I'd say, aside from that, and a general interest in processes of social change, philosophies of social change, ideas about why society does or does not change, and so forth, had always been part of my academic interest. And I encountered a person who said to me that he had evidence that he displayed to me that Japan was 200 years ahead of the West. Now, whoa, that's not possible. No one's ahead of the West, and no one's ahead of the United States. But he didn't convince me that one way or the other, except he made me do something that I discovered other people around the world were also beginning to do. Well, what's after development? What's after you achieved high economic growth? What's the future? And development theory and so forth didn't say anything about that. Once you're developed, you're developed. And everyone else is more or less catching up. So that single event, more than anything, made me a futurist, made me say, okay, whether it's true or false, what is the future of the United States? And when I left Rikyo after 6 years in Japan and went to VPI Virginia Tech in the mountains of Appalachia, first of all, culture shock beyond belief to go from Tokyo to those dark hollers. But it's a very high-tech place. And there was a big space community. And I became very much interested in that and in their architectural department. And I taught the very first futures course ever taught anywhere in the United States, in any event, at the university level that had gone through the normal processes of getting a course admitted at Virginia Tech from 1967 to 69. And I was invited to come to Hawaii, where where there was already a state-led future-oriented activity, citizen-based, called Hawaii 2000. So this is 1970, and the state is already thinking about 30 years ahead. And I just showed up having some ideas about how to do this, how to think usefully about the futures, and immediately got involved in that. And the university created the legislature actually created the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, and we began a graduate program at the MA and PhD level, teaching people how to be consulting futurists. And one of the courses that I taught, you sort of mentioned it in the introduction, is governance design, designing new forms of governance. I taught it both at the undergraduate and the graduate level at the University of Hawaii. And I was disappointed with my undergraduates. They seemed so conservative, so unable to think outside any box. I said, okay, let's pretend we're on Mars and let's design a government for Mars. So originally, my interest in governance in Mars and in Mars and the space community generally was really just as a little ploy to get them to recognize whatever you have on Earth, it's not going to be on Mars unless you consciously create it, bring it, cause it to be there. And I gave a little talk about that, I think to an L5 community group. One of the people in the audience was Ben Finney. Ben was an anthropologist who had caught the eye of NASA because Ben's anthropological expertise was on the Pacific Islanders who came from actually China and then throughout Polynesia and eventually up to Hawaii, sailing across the Pacific Ocean by techniques that were a mystery to most Westerners at the time. He explained the mystery. And Ben's focus was on how that long-range traveling changed a group of people who were the same when they set out from China, but as they went to the various islands throughout the Pacific, developed completely different cultures, physiologically different, linguistically different, and all of their cultures different. There were groups of them, but there were also mutually exclusive groups simply by the process of traveling long distances and then being relatively isolated, not completely isolated from each other. That process, Ben said, is what humanity is about to do. And NASA was interested in that idea. And Ben and I both became members of the University of Hawaii Space Committee. And we heard about this new university being created by three guys at MIT that was going to be called International Space University. So Ben went to the founding meeting of that idea and invited me to come and teach at ISU. He would give the main lectures and I would do workshops. And that began in 1994. I think you might have said 84, but 1994. That was the first time that I went to what was called a space program, special space program. And also I was involved in creating the master's MSS program at the headquarters in Strasbourg, where it exists now. And so I was involved every year in going to the Strasbourg campus and to wherever the summer session had to be, working with people in the ISU community who are from all over the world, all walks of life, in the space community. So ISU is not just focused on the technical part, although they certainly focus on that, but on the humanistic part, on the business part, on the scientific part, on the ethical part, how science fiction has motivated many of the early pioneers to do the things they ultimately did. These human reasons for going into space is what motivated me. So space and futures have always been intimately joined with each other.
Yeah, well, Jim, I completely agree. coming at it from the other angle as a technical, enthusiast in the background from space, and then moving into futures, a lot of the questions root back to, what does it mean to be human? And when we do think about beyond commercialization or presence, what are we building? So I totally
Right.
resonate with how you've looked at space through the lenses of your career. I'd love to kind of get your perspective on how have things changed, especially given, maybe some recent events, in terms of where you think space is going. Are there any fundamental shifts that you see, from your perspective as a futurist?
Well, yes, I think there are. Sorry, I'm losing my earbud
Oh, no,
here,
that's
but I
okay.
hope I can still hear. Okay, so the main thing that I've seen from the early days is obviously the fact that space per se is not as big as positive in the consciousness of most Americans that it used to be, but it's not nothing. I think the future and space still are closely linked in the minds of many Americans as well. Uh, but at the main reason for the American space program in the form that it evolved was primarily in competition with that of the Soviet Union. So there was a competitive military as well as prestige reason and back of why the space program existed. And when the Soviet Union collapsed for a variety of reasons, in a sense, the intensity of the American program and the political and military and ideological necessity
Mhm.
and foundation of it faded away, and we had to find other reasons for it. And science, of course, from my point of view, should be one of the major drivers. But to the average individual, there's not necessarily a big interest in science per se. And so there needed to be other reasons once the military ideological reason had apparently disappeared. And so the commercial reason for going into space emerged, and the entrepreneurial, instead of it being something driven by a governmental agency, it's increasingly been something that is done by people who are interested in making money, that see space as an arena in which you can do things that are profitable. That might be space tourism, that might be, which originally was laughed at as a ridiculous idea, but then is understood, well, why not? And there already are beginnings of it. And then also things like space mining, which is highly controversial, but is also a driver and so forth. But from my point of view, the main difference, which most Americans still haven't grasped, in my understanding, is it's no longer dominated by the United States. The future is not of space is not necessarily American. Now, ISU is set up in order to be global, to be multicultural, to embrace all of humanity. And so I am naturally attracted to that type of orientation. America should be a leading part, no doubt about it, but it is not now, and it won't necessarily in the future be the dominant part. Now, most Americans have unfortunately been encouraged to look upon China as a big enemy. It's an enemy, if it's an enemy at all, it's partly because we're forcing it to be one in a certain sense. They have wanted to cooperate. They've been active members in the ISU community, and they are interested in a global and peaceful usage of space, as many Americans are as well. So it's a much more international thing. India has a very vibrant space community. Japan has for a long time. Europe, of course, individual nations like France, but the European community as well. So space now is, and I think needs to be looked at in every aspect as a global activity and not just a national one. And in some ways, the entrepreneurial money-making thing fits into that, but in other ways, it contrasts with that, is in conflict with it. So these are the main changes I've seen as well. But if I can make a final point on this, there is also a concern about the future of the globe in general, environmental issues, global climate change, the effect of all of these satellites, perhaps making it impossible for humans to launch the vehicles that need to be launched to go into space. So there is, in some people's mind, a question of, is the space era over? I don't think so at all, but I do respect and acknowledge and think everyone needs to take seriously the arguments that it might be.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up some great themes there in terms of, the changing, power states, how that's driving activity, the international presence, the commoditization and commercialization of space, and then, of course, climate change and what that means for our destiny here on Earth. Our discussion today is really all about, how do we use foresighting to create constructive futures, right? Because if we're only looking at sort of the nearer term sphere of trends and signals, we might be able to box ourselves in and not necessarily drive towards preferred or aspirational futures. So I don't know if you have any tips, especially for the space community, on how do we leverage that longer view so that we're driving towards more of those aspirational guide stars, if you will, about what we're building towards.
Well, would it be appropriate at this point for me to say something about the four futures methods, or
That's
do you
it's a
have that?
perfect lead in. Yes.
Okay. So when I got to go back to the beginning, the Big Bang, when I was first involved in both futures and in space, I used the word future in the singular, the future. And as a behavioral political scientist, I believed that I could predict the future and that we could, in that prediction, perhaps shape the sort of future we wanted. But there was one future, and it was a high-tech, space-driven, technology-driven future, very optimistic from some points of view. But I very early discovered, well, there are other perspectives. The environmental movement was just becoming important, concerned about population growth, concerned about energy and pollution. All of these things in the 70s, especially, dominated. That was the major way people thought about the future. Also, there was great social changes going on in that time. The idea initially of an integrated society, and then of a notion that, well, maybe there were Black Lives Matter, if you will, as was a concern in the 60s and 70s as well. And I thought it was going to be resolved at that time, but unfortunately not. And also the women's movement. So I saw that there, and Native people here in Hawaii and elsewhere, saying, wait, the future you're talking about, the high-tech stuff, where are we in that? How does that relate to the way we have been treated and mistreated in the past? What is the role of women? Is it always only white men that are making all the decisions? Shouldn't we be part of it? So I discovered, wait, there's not a single future. There are many different possibilities. There are many different images. And I realized that future studies doesn't study the future. The future doesn't exist. And I can tell you from a lifetime of being a futurist, I'm still in the present. I'm not in the future. And so I see the future constantly as before us and open to some extent. At least no one is able to predict it. And I developed over a considerable amount of time and perfected, if you will, here at the University of Hawaii with my students and colleagues, the notion that out of the billions of images that people have about the future and details of the future, these billions can be put down into four generic categories. One is called grow, or economic growth, or continued economic growth, or continuation. That's one. Focusing on economics and the kind of ideas that are found in ideas of progress and of economic growth being material growth, everyone's better. But then immediately, those group of people that were concerned about collapse, about the fact that just economic growth is a cancer on the planet. And it also is not only eating and destroying the planet, it's eating and destroying cultures that valuable. The early cultures were not bad. They weren't evil. They weren't stupid. They were a different way of looking. They had other ideas about what was important. And that if we continued this blind movement, we would collapse. Now, over the years, as a futurist, the collapse scenario was very difficult to get decision makers to take seriously. But the world we live in now, even before COVID, but certainly in the past year, where many systems have collapsed, or at least seem to have been stopped in ways that were never anticipated, collapse scenarios are very popular once again. But it would be wrong, in my opinion, to say that is the future. It's one of the other alternative futures, possible futures. And a third is, I originally called it conserver, from work done in Canada, the conserver society, in contrast to the consumer society. The conserver society, I now call it discipline, is disciplined in the sense of the term an academic discipline, in which, as a political scientist, I focus on a very small number of things that are part of the whole world. I discipline myself to that way of looking at things. Now, one reason I'm a futurist is I'm not very disciplined, and a futurist has to know a little bit about everything. As I like to say, there's nothing that you don't need to know. You need to be able to understand how all processes in the world work, which no single individual can possibly do. But futurists should strive towards it. But nonetheless, there are people, especially here in Hawaii and elsewhere, indigenous people around the world, that say we lost fundamental values that our society, our ancestors held dear, and enabled them to live wonderful lives. And so they want to recapture in a modern context the values that were destroyed 200 or 300 years ago. That's another example. And then, of course, the whole idea of the environmentalist, of the original sustainable society idea. We are not in a sustainable society now. They would like to make it be sustainable again. I prefer the term evolvable to sustainable. We want to be able to evolve, to live, but not to stop moving, stop changing. So those are three: grow, collapse, which, by the way, I should have said and will say now, is also the other term I'm using for it is new beginnings. The collapse, and none of the four futures are good futures. None of the four futures are bad futures. They each have good and bad, winners and losers. The job of the futurist is to help you figure out how to win, how to be successful, whatever the future actually turns out to be. And so that's most obviously the case in collapse. If society collapses, we have to begin all over again, and we can perhaps have a new creation, new ideas. So the collapse should be one of the most optimistic futures for people who think they have bright ideas about the way the world should work. But that is the nuts and bolts of the fourth future: transform. And I would say when I originally got into futures, most of the futurists that I knew at that time believed in social, environmental, uh, geophysical transformation. And the image of transformation is, in a sense, the most difficult to understand because we don't know what it's going to look like. And so, what processes do we have on Earth that are in which the future is not predictable from the present? Well, I grew up in Florida, and while I've lived in places where it snow, I'm living in Hawaii. And in neither place, neither Florida nor Hawaii, did we have snow or ice. The idea that liquid water would suddenly freeze was not something common. And yet, you guys in the north, that's what happens. Something you call winter. And I look at it, I think it's a horrible way to live, but don't worry, there's spring. It'll begin being okay again. Yeah, then things go out of control and you have to get your lawnmower to cut nature back again. So you go through these cycles of transformation. And then, of course, the most mysterious of all is when water changes into steam, into a vapor. So it is totally unpredictable from either ice or running water. Another example of what transformation means is that little caterpillar going along the branch, stopping, building a cocoon. And out of that cocoon comes not another caterpillar, a butterfly. How did that happen? That is transformation. I cannot tell you what the transformational future will look like. I can only say that we are partly responsible for it. We are its parents. And like any parents, we are responsible for our children while they're being nurtured and learning, but then they grow up and are not us. They're something else. So that's another example of transformation. There are generally two types of transformational futures. One is a high-tech transformation, and that's my perspective. And the other is high spirit, a spiritual transformation. And I'm very respectful of that, but I believe that change occurs as a result of behavior, and behavior is a result of new technologies. So technology creates new behavior, which creates new values, which leads to rapid social change. And in our case, given the nature of the technologies we have now, it's transformational change, unpredictable change, not linear change. So those are the four futures. And I say to any group that wants to think about the future of their organization, of their community, of their country, of the world, you need to think of all four futures and then prepare yourselves to be successful in each one. So at ISU and elsewhere, I ask students to go to an exercise in which I place them in each one of the four futures and ask them what a space program would look like if we have continued growth, if we have a social environmental collapse, if we were to discipline around a set of values, whether they be religious or cultural or environmental or whatever they might be, discipline around these values or transformation. And in my case, I encourage them to think about how the technologies that are emerging now, artificial intelligence, all the other electronic and post electronic biological technologies are leading, arguably, to posthumans, transhumans, something else transformational. So, quickly, but not quickly enough, perhaps, those are the four futures. And the task of the space community is to find a way to be successful in each one of the four so that if we move clearly one way or another, you're prepared for it and you're able to move forward.
Wow, that was an excellent explanation from the person that you want to ask about the four futures. So I really appreciate that. So
Thank you.
we're gonna have a little fun because we're gonna mash up your four futures with some of the key themes that are coming out of our recent release over at CSPS, the Pathfinder's Guide to the Space Enterprise. And so this was, a map that we kind of created using systematic foresighting methods. We had over 70 of our experts and thought leaders in our company help us create this map. And there are 7 core themes that we're going to help assess across 4 futures that you and I discuss. So those 7 themes are intelligence infrastructure, conflict, players, workforce, resources, access, and exploration. And I will prompt you along the way here, Jim, of which one we're going to reflect on which future. So we're going to start moving through a set of possible or plausible 4 futures and do a little bit of futurist back and forth on what that could mean. Okay. So I'll set the first one up here. So we're going to look at the growth future. So this one is steady as we go towards commoditization. So this is kind of along the lines of some of the things that you're already talking about in today's signaling, is that there is growth in international and global participation. And it's not just the United States or China or a military space, but a more inclusive, a more vibrant space. Perhaps this leads to commoditization, but in general, there still isn't a lot of clarity on that, as you were talking about before, that what happens after we build it and after we get there and we make it profitable, then what? What does it mean from a humanity and governance standpoint? And then also, what else might be going on in the world that might drive what happens in space? So I think, just setting the stage on a potential growth future, what are some of the implications that this might have for something like access to space, whether that's physical from a launch standpoint or virtual from, going to space through robotics or having an avatar or something like that?
Well, we happen at this very moment to be in a rather unfortunate situation in which everything is on hold because of the pandemic. There has never been a time when you can easily predict the future, but this is one of the very times when it's very difficult to talk about, especially the continued growth future, the growth future, because it's absolutely uncertain what the world's going to be like after COVID is over, if COVID is ever over. I think the evidence is becoming clearer and clearer that there's no time we can say we are free of COVID-19, but because it's continuously mutating, it might just become something else we have to worry about and get an annual vaccine about or not. And in the meantime, so many processes of continued growth were interrupted by the COVID because so many activities, economic activities, were closed down. So you have tremendous change of the workforce, with many people thinking we're now going to be moving quickly into much more telework and more people out of work with the social consequences of that. And the supply chains that we assumed were fixed in the past globally may be restored again or may not. So I think, though, that I can look around. I constantly am seeing how other people react to what's happening now with the lens of the future. There are plenty of people in business, and in fact, many ordinary people who simply want their old job back, even though they complained about the job at the time, even though it wasn't a great job, at least it was something they understood. And so there are tremendous pressures to try to restore the old political economic system. And I think you need to look at them and understand them. But it's never been more important to recognize that you need to think of the other ones as well. Now, if we can restore the old economic system, then we will have continued globalization of everything, and at the same time, because one of the other elements of the other futures is a movement away from globalization back to neo-nationalism, neo-traditionalism. The United States itself, for example, even though until Trump, we assumed that the global economic system was a highly desirable one, with Trump and his Make America Great and focus on America, that became the way America was going to do things. And we withdrew from many multinational things, cooperative things, and said we'd do stuff our way. But that same phenomenon happened all over the world. So that they're in India, in Japan, in China, certainly, in Brazil, in Hungary, in all other parts of the world, there are anti-globalist, pro-nationalist forces that are strong. And so I think the immediate future of continued growth is which one is going to grow. Will we continue to focus on the nation? If you look at what Biden is proposing, in many ways, it's what Trump wanted to do, and in response to what many Americans want, to just protect ourselves, protect our borders, develop our own space program, a very strong space program. We'll allow others at our choice to participate in it, but it's all ours. I don't think Biden's going to go that far, but he has shown so far a positive interest in space, and people were not sure that was going to be the case. So I would say these are some of the elements that would be part of a continued growth future. It won't be like it was before. Continuation is continuation of the processes, not of the structures and consequences. There's a lot of change in a growth. Well, that's the meaning of growth. Things are growing. But you understand the roots and you understand the processes. So that's whether globalistically or nationalistically, in fact, maybe we'll have renewed, that might be happening now with China, renewed interest in space because we see China as a competitor.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your perspective on, even a continuation has a lot of flavors and variants that could pan out over time. And that's an exercise in and of itself to think about. Okay,
Yes.
so moving on to a potential collapse scenario. So this one could be, humanity is at the brink for a variety of reasons. Perhaps, the global, climate crisis kind of swallows all of space's aspirations, all of the money, all of the time, the effort goes into terrestrial focus, or perhaps there's some sort of AI existential threat that happens here on Earth, where we're, again, Matrix style, really focused on here, not really thinking about moving out into the things that we have our eye on. And so one of the themes in our map was looking at the intelligence infrastructure and, what would be some of the impact if we were focused on Earth versus, you know, trying to expand out. If there was something kind of in the way of us looking to expand.
Well, when I asked students at ISU over the years to think about the four futures, generally the collapsed future uh, did not have a active space program in the sense of going to Moon and Mars and beyond. They recognized that probably couldn't be achieved, but they did. If you notice that the when you speak of the space program now, that's not what it is. It's satellites for the most part. And so the satellite part of the space program would probably continue and grow and become more important, even if you weren't putting up new satellites for
Hmm.
any reason. There are so many up there at the present time that there are ways that we will have ways of utilizing old material that still hangs around above us in a useful way. I think of that because one of the things that was happening when I came to Hawaii in 1970, 1970, was using an obsolete satellite of NASA for communication between Hawaii and other Pacific islands, using that old satellite, which was not very reliable, but reliable enough that it could be used for emergency purposes of communicating the small islands when they have a health problem or a natural disaster, to letting the rest of the world know the situation. And so it is a way of thinking about what a space program might be in terms of collapse. And it certainly fits into the Intel question or perspective that you're asking about. Those things will still be up there. And if we can generate electricity and make machines, and I see no reason why we can't, just not on the scale and not necessarily with the materials we use now, then have a space program that is really more in keeping what our space program is now. It's using space for benefits on Earth, for health, for governance, for disaster, for integration, for mail, for companionship, all these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think for our discipline scenario is sort of similar, but instead of taking it completely off the table, we're saying that space is becoming less important as we focus inward, but it's still vitally important. So perhaps, right, in the economic turndown, there may be a massive turndown, perhaps, God forbid, another global pandemic or something at, massive scale. There's social unrest that's happening around the world that really just, reduces the stability of government money and larger corporate money going into these initiatives. Maybe there's a debris event that happens where part of the orbits that we're planning on using aren't readily available. Um, how might this push us into unique trade spaces? Because as you had kind of talked about, these aren't good or bad scenarios, right? We're just pulling the thread a bit and talking about, how do you make lemonade
If
out of the lemons
societies
that life
like
throws
this,
you?
then what? How can we have a successful space program? That's
Yeah,
the way to look at it.
exactly.
And I think that I would like to pick up on what you were just saying in terms of the real urgency of the environmental issue of sea level rise. I This has been something that a lot of politicians in the U.S. haven't wanted to think about and have discouraged us from thinking about, unfortunately, because years ago I had uh, global climate change in only two of the futures. Uh, Collapse and discipline. But as reality got closer and closer, I realized you had global climate change across all four futures. The only thing that was different was how severe it was and how we responded to it. And I think we still need to understand that people who say it's literally all over for humanity have a better case than usual. They're not crazy in thinking that. The enormity of what the change might be could be horrible. In any case, it's possible it would be minimal, that we are mistaken, that the natural processes for another ice age to come, which in the reckoning and rhythms of ice ages, we are due for one, could somehow mitigate against global climate change. And we would experience it in a mild way, sort of like the way COVID turned out to be relatively mild compared to the original analogy of the 1918 flu that statistically was much more of a killer than ours is, COVID is. So you just will have it in a different degree in each one of the four futures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, if you're going to look at, how might space resources be impacted by that kind of constraint future, you could think of, changing of food supply, and how does space add value, in terms of knowing where that and anticipating when those weather patterns are happening, or from a commerce standpoint. So those are pretty easy connections, right, to make.
Right.
And then, of course, everybody's favorite, right? You talk about the caterpillar turning into the butterfly, our transformation. So in this one, you and I decided to look at how humanity itself is changing, both in biology as well as in our integration of AI, that allows us to have a suitable, sustained presence in space. And so, kind of working through what are, and maybe even a tech breakthrough, right? What if, our coupled intelligence with quantum science or warp drive, on top of our own ability to survive long lengths in space, what does that mean? What does that mean for the future of the workforce or for exploration?
Well, I think it also is the question of what it means for the future of humanity, as you raised that issue before, that's one of the things space has always been about. It makes us question what it means to be human. And I think artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, whatever you want to call it, these developments, nanotechnology, new synthesized materials, interactive learning buildings, and so forth, these are potentially transformational. Now, the continued growth perspective on AI says, no, it just helps us be more productive. We'll always have to have people working, but it'll be different. They'll be doing different things because artificial intelligence will be doing all the thinking, and robots will be doing all the working, so we can do something else. And so each one of, as is the case in every other driving force, it's present in each one of the four futures, but in different ways. And by the way, these four futures were discovered. I didn't make them up. And there are plenty of people and plenty of literature and plenty of images supporting each one of the four. They are out there in the real world. They're not just artificial constructs of my making. And so there are people making the argument that artificial intelligence and robotics is trivial, and there are those that are making the argument that it's transformative. And I'm pretty much of that point of view. I have a increasingly moving towards trying to get people to understand the only way to solve the problem of unemployment caused by artificial intelligence robots is to have a goal of full unemployment, a goal where no one has to work, that it's all done by artificial intelligence and transhumans or whoever, and humans now have a chance to do what we like to do, which I say is play and pray. We can do those things really well, and we would be free to do it, and all goods and services would be produced. Now, without our labor, moving from that society, from to that society from this society has to be taken care of. The people who are immediately put out of work by artificial intelligence must be given access to goods and services, even though they don't work anymore, until full unemployment can be realized. But I think it also one of the most important things is one of the things you said in raising the question: what will it do to humanity and space? Because humans in this body are not fit for space. And so we have to make an environment that's more or less Earth-like, but it's more like a prison on Earth than a really garden. It's not really inviting for many people to go into space, given the amount of discipline, if you will, that goes along with the process. And so I think that one of the things we must eagerly look towards transforming is, in fact, the human body and the mind that is this transformation will make possible. And if you look at the people that say we're really making major changes on Earth, we evolved 30,000 years ago as part of a long million-year process up into Homo sapiens, emerging about 30,000 years ago in our present form, in a world that is not the world we're in now. We did not evolve to live in the way the world is in 2021. And so, as the world continues to change, our own body in its old form is going to have difficulty even surviving on Earth, never mind surviving for space travel. So I think I go back to Ben Finney's notion of the deep space program. Environmental pressures are working again on evolution. They were more or less were complete as far as Homo sapiens is concerned quite a while ago. But with new environments on Earth and in space, humans obviously will change. Now, 90% of the stuff I read about that either says it isn't going to happen or it shouldn't happen and it's bad. The 10% that I like says, look, this is just, we humans are not the crown of creation. We're simply the most recent evolutionary portion. We shouldn't be opposed to this. We should be, well, the metaphor I always use is surfing tsunami. These are tsunamis coming towards us. We need not to deny them, not to run away from them, but to look at them, study them like a surfer studies the waves, go out there and surf them for fun. And one of the ones that I really am trying to surf myself and encourage others is this transformation from Homo sapiens to other forms, not one, many other forms of life and intelligence that I think these technological developments make possible.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, how cool was that? We just did a 4 Futures exercise with Jim Dator himself on the future of space. So bringing this home, the whole topic of our discussion was about creating constructive futures and turning them into reality based on our foresighting work. So as we've kind of walked through this exercise and you're looking across what we discussed, how do we start creating those positive visions for positive outcomes? Do you have any recommendations from your great history of work back to the space community on this one?
Well, one of the things that really impacted me when I moved to Hawaii was the fact that the governor and the legislature and the business and intellectual community was already thinking about the future, but it wasn't being done by elites, by exclusive people. It was a citizen-based activity, old and young, all of the various cultures that we have here in Hawaii that are really quite different in terms of some of the values that are important to them. They all participated in this activity. And if it's possible to have elements of agreement without watering down the differences, we should do those things. But I believe that technologically and intellectually, we need to move towards forms of governance, forms of decision making that aren't based upon majority rule. That if you get 51 or 50.1% of the people agreeing to one thing, then everybody has to do it. That doesn't work. That's never worked. Humans fundamentally want consensus and strive for consensus. That's something else that I've discovered when I do the four futures on governance with my students all over the world. They really, their preferred form of government is a tribal society where everybody knows everybody else and everybody communicates and participates in decision making. That's fundamental to humans. Well, how do you do it on a global level with so many different cultures and languages? And many people, when I talk about preferred futures, who feel that they are who are in situations of deprivation or suffering racism, sexism, all the other exclusionary perspectives, say, whose preferred future? Is your preferred future my preferred future? Is it my preferred future if I don't get a chance to participate? Not likely. One of the things that social scientists learned long ago is something called the participation hypothesis, that you are probably, even a good decision will be rejected by people who didn't get to participate in making it. And even a bad decision will be supported and made as good as possible as long as people got to participate in it. So allowing people to participate and then trying to find ways, if unity won't work it, to find different ways in which people are able to behave as they wish, and the consequences of it are associated with them, not necessarily for everyone. So it's a way of individualized government and individualized decision making. Once upon a time, one size fit all in the industrial age. Then we went to large, medium, and small. As we got bigger, we got extra large and extra, extra large, and even larger than that large, but it still doesn't fit. It's still not us. And so we, once upon a time, made things specifically for us. And I think we need to do that again. I'd like to emphasize that all the anthropological evidence that I am familiar with, but it's controversial, but nonetheless, is that life was good in early hunting and gathering societies. For most of humanity's time on Earth, we lived in what's called subsistence affluence. Nature was so beneficial, humans were so few, that the environment provided everything we wanted. We didn't have to work. Hunting and gathering and sowing and other things like that were uniform games. They were communal ways to do things together and chat about things and gossip and all the rest. It wasn't viewed as work. Work is a relatively early invention of agriculture and then certainly of industrialization. And so the transformational future allows a possibility for returning to affluence where you're not engaged in working, but you are engaged in community decision making with other people. Easy to say, difficult to do, but it needs to be done every time anybody in the space community or any other community tries to make a decision. Everyone who will be impacted by that decision needs to be participating in making the decision, or at least real representatives of everyone, if it's too much for everyone to participate. That's the main lesson.
Yeah. Yeah, no, those are some great insights. And I think obviously, our team spends most of our day jobs really thinking about, how do we get all the right groups involved and how do we mature our story? What's our next evolution, moving into space? And foresighting is it's been such a great toolkit to try to bring along those folks and have those discussions where it's okay if we don't see eye to eye. That's not the point, right? We're trying to look for commonalities. We're trying to carve out, and some that's greater than the parts. So You know, what a treat this was. Thank you for coming on our show. I know our audience is just so thrilled that they got to have these insights from you. You know, you're a trailblazer, you're a legend, you really are. And it has been an
I'm just
honor,
Jim
really, for
Dator.
this
I'm none of
discussion.
those things.
Yes,
Absolutely
you are.
false.
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
Well, thank you. Thank you
Okay,
so
thank you
much.
very
And
much. I appreciate it.
yes, you know, we really appreciate this. And, stay tuned for more futures work coming from our shop. And Rebecca, we're going to hand it back over to you.
A big thanks to Jim and Kara for that great discussion. We also have a new member of the production team, Jordan Bingham, and we would like to thank Sarah Panoni for all her great work she's done for the show, and we wish her the best in all her future endeavors. And also thank you to Colleen Stover and James Liggins. As always, check us out on Twitter using hashtag the Space Policy Show and sign up for our latest news and alerts at aerospace.org/policy. We look forward to having you tune into our next episode, and until then, take care.